Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Marietta Balázs and I welcome you also on behalf of the Youth Partnership between the European Commission and the Council of Europe in the field of youth. We are very happy that you joined us for this fourth and last webinar of the MOOC on Essentials of Youth Work. And in case you missed our previous webinars, you can find the live sessions on our Facebook page, soon also on our YouTube, and soon we will also publish all the graphic recordings. So welcome again, and I give the floor to my colleagues, and I wish you all a very fruitful and nice webinar.
Thank you, Marietta. Hello from my side as well. My name is Snežana. I'm one of the facilitators of the MOOC, Essentials of Youth Work. And together with my colleagues Tarek and Katja, we are here to host you and also to host our guests for today. As Marietta said, this is the fourth webinar in the series, but actually slightly different than the others because it should have a different format. We have 4 speakers who would kind of provide more thought-provoking inputs. We are also welcoming your questions, also input from your side. So this is also integrated in that. And we will have space to really have talks about the debates, dilemmas in youth work today. And we also have with us Olaja, who will be following us graphically. So you will see some wonderful visuals throughout the webinar. And then I think I can welcome our guests. So today we have with us Adina Şerban, who is a guest, but also not, because she's in fact a member of the team as well. She was helping us with the content from a researcher perspective, but today she's in a different role and she will talk about the have an overarching input that will speak about general dilemmas and debates in youth work. We also have Laimonas Ragauskas, who will talk about digitalisation, who is also very experienced on this topic and was one of the facilitators of the MOOC on digital youth work. We have Ajša Hadžibegović, who is an experienced youth worker, fellow trainer, and she will talk about the shrinking space for civil society. And Yael Ohana, who is also a practitioner and very experienced in the field, will talk about the political role of youth work. So a lot of inputs ahead. We will have first 2 inputs, then some space for questions, and then another 2. So please feel free to use Q&A option of the webinar if you're here with us on Zoom. And if you're not, then you can also post your question on Facebook and my colleagues will respond. Yeah. I think we can start. And as promised, as we said, the format is a little bit different. So basically, each of the inputs will start with a question that I will now share on the screen. It's on Mentimeter. So have your either another tab or your other device ready. And then we will actually ask you one question that will then support our speaker in responding to that. And then actually also kind of shaping the input around it. So sharing the screen. Just a second. Here we go. We have the first slide. Just to wait maybe for a couple of seconds for people to join. So if you are here with us, you can press either on the heart or the cat, and then the first question will come to you. So when I see some responses on the hearts and cats, then I can proceed. If you don't see, and if you haven't used the Mentimeter before, you just go to menti.com and use the code that you can see on the top of the page, which is 15742623. And 1 cat arrived, which is great. And heart as well, maybe just a couple of more seconds. And maybe I can actually move because it seems that the Menti is working. So here is our first question for you. What are the main debates related to youth work in your local or national context? You can just type your answer and it will appear on the screen and will help Adina in her input, but maybe also the other speakers as well. So let's see what we have. There's always this wonderful and slightly uncomfortable silence while waiting for the first inputs. And hopefully they will soon arrive. I think just to assure you, our speakers are very, in a way, ready and knowledgeable to speak about their topics. But of course, your input will help them in a way to understand maybe what are the needs also on the field. Okay, so one of the main debates, which is interestingly enough, the team was speaking about this just earlier when preparing for the webinar, is supporting LGBTQ young people. Post-capitalism in destroying young people's future. Okay, that's quite a sharp one. Thank you. Then another one, how to make them competent and develop necessary skills. So skills development or competence development of young people through youth work, recognition of youth work, diversity and inclusion. Do we have some more? Youth unemployment, which is also has been a topic for quite some time now. Rural youth work. And access of young people from rural areas to youth work provisions. Who is youth work serving primarily? That's a very interesting one. Youth engagement and diversity and inclusion. So diversity and inclusion repeats in a way. Maybe we just wait to see if we get a couple of more. If not, if it stabilizes, then I think I can stop sharing and then invite Adina to actually offer her perspective on this topic of the kind of capturing some of the main debates that are going on in the youth work field. Adina, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you, Snezana, for wrapping up a bit what happened with the slide. And thank you all for spending the afternoon with us. I was having a look at the contributions there and just wondering, it's like a mind reading exercise, and it's good somehow that they were presented before, because in my input, I would retake some of them. Okay, let me share. I just have a couple of slides. So yeah, it's basically about questions, reflections, and triangles. And why the triangles? I always say that, I'm a researcher, a youth researcher, but I had the opportunity to be involved with policy development as well. And the greatest luxury in my CV, I would say, it's the fact that I still work with young people in the rural areas. So I always try to stay connected to the real youth needs, as I'm calling them. Always about the triangle and about this magical triangle, about how youth issues somehow should be looked at based on this permanent trialogue between research, youth workers, practitioners in this case, and also policymakers. And I would say that nothing is impossible without these triangles. And whether we like it or not, if we were fans of geometry or not, it doesn't matter. In youth work, without those triangles, I still have questions regarding the efficiency of our activities. Speaking of the things that we've always carried with us, I think that in all these three angles of the triangle, we have to start with a question regarding how many. How many young people do we really serve indeed? For how many young people do we develop policies? How many young people do we really include in our research? I do have the feeling that we never knew how many young people are there, even though you'd say, well, but we have statistics and we have reports. Yeah, I know all those, I've been involved with them, but how many young people are still there? And we probably work, let's say, with the usual suspects. So when we do research, it's easy to find those ones who are already on the stage. When we deliver youth work services, of course, it's easier to work with young people with whom we have been working before. So I do believe there are some groups that we don't really even touch somehow, or if we do deliver services, there are still some others who would not be part of our projects and initiatives. We also have the pandemic, which we cannot neglect. And I do see the pandemic as a scar that we'll be carrying with us for a while. So we had no clue how many needs were there. before, and now with the pandemic, I still have the question about the number. So do we really know how many young people are in our country, in our community, in Europe, or worldwide? So I do have this question regarding the numbers. I also have another question regarding the how much. So how much do we know about youth needs and interests? How much do we really know about the real youth needs and interests? Because we will say, well, young people have these preferences and they have these needs, but there are so many groups that we probably don't work with, and we don't really know how much of their needs and interests are reflected in policies, in programs and projects. And I've seen that wonderful group that I really adore, so working with rural youth. And when I'm looking at what is being developed for young people living in the rural areas, it's a lot on farming and trying to create rural entrepreneurs. But, agriculture is not everything in their life. So there's a lot that we should do in terms of interests and aspirations. How much do we know about youth preferences, including here forms of participation? So we've been questioning a lot these forms of participation, and we are all, whenever elections are coming, we always ask, so where are our young people and how do they participate? But it seems that we don't know a lot about that. What's happening with youth during the pandemic and post-pandemic? We somehow started running some research projects, but again, are we really running them with and for all young people, or just with the usual suspects? What are youth workers doing at the moment? And I know that there are some let's say, words that not all youth workers would love, and that would be policies and politics. But I do believe that is nothing possible without the two. Because to really be able to respond to the youth needs, then you as a youth worker should be aware of all these policies and with politics, because, youth work should be on the agenda if we want that recognition that we were speaking about earlier. Public services are the key, and I'm coming from a country, from Romania, where not that much investment is being done in youth work. So I know what does it mean to work on this project-based approach. So it's a project where you work and then it's finishing and then you start another one, and you as a youth worker, you get tired and somehow trying to focus the energy on trying to find additional resources as well. So what about the sustainability of our work? Also, the policy framework had been developed during the old normal, and I'm now looking at the European Youth Strategy. So both the ones developed by the European Union and also the Council of Europe, and that was for the old normal when the pandemic is not there. And what we need, and is relevant for youth work as well, would be to come up with some policies that would tackle somehow the new normal. And I think that the youth workers really have a voice in that, because they do work directly with young people. Youth work is not an isolated island, so we have to go back to the magic triangle and to the corners, and to make sure that we always interact with research and also with the policymakers, and to speak out loud, to speak about our young people, and also to reflect their needs and interests. And also, youth work is the first point of contact. And also the pandemic might have forced a bit the outreach, and that's a very relevant topic for the current moment, because we have to think of the new outreach instruments that we should use in order to get to those young people that we don't know where they are at the moment. About emergency and sustainability. So do we really need to reinvent the wheel? And I'm now thinking about the social inclusion dimension, because we've been working with young people, and there are a lot of young people with fewer opportunities. And looking back at the pandemic, there's a lot in terms of digital opportunities. And maybe the good part in this pandemic was the fact that young people were offered so many digital opportunities, but were they really open for all young people? Because I do have the feeling that there's plenty of groups who didn't have access to that due to the lack of equipment or connectivity. So do we really have to reinvent the wheel in youth work at the moment? There's also questions in terms of recognition and trust. And I know that at times the institutions would have the tendency to say that, okay, digital youth work, it's nice. it worked during the pandemic, but let's go back to the residential format. I'm not sure that this is really the right approach for the wonderful resources and efforts that youth workers put in developing these digital tools. About the old normal, and the new normal, once the pandemic is gone, do we really go back to the old reality that we know? And everyone would be asking if what we developed in youth work about all these wonderful instruments, would we still be able to use them once the pandemic is gone, or they were developed, they were wonderful, but they are not here to stay? And I think that Laimonas would really have some great answers regarding that, and regarding the sustainability of the practices that we developed in youth work, while we are trying still to stay close to our young people during the lockdown. So these are just a few, let's say, questions that I managed to collect from youth workers directly, and also in research interests from my colleagues. But they're open questions, so it was only the aim somehow to come up with some questions, and maybe during the webinar to try to find out some answers to these questions. Back to
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adina. Thank you for this. I didn't know fully what to expect in terms of like this overview. I think it was really great that you raised these questions that, as I think any proper debate or dilemma, don't have really clear answers. They just open more and more questions, but it was very, very good to have them captured. And I find this presentation also to be a great resource. So hopefully we can use it on the MOOC just to stimulate people to think, and maybe also to compare how is it in their realities, whether it fits some of the debates and dilemmas in the local national context. But also, as you said, you responded to quite some things that were raised in the Menti. So I think that was very meaningful as well. This is just another reminder to use a Q&A option. If you have questions, we will move to Laimonas with the input on digitalization, but then after his input, we come back to Adina and Laimonas. So whichever question comes, then we will post it to them. So thanks again, Adina. Laimonas, are you ready for your input and maybe the question that comes?
Hi, yeah. I am ready, and perhaps Snezhana, you can show the question that I would invite you to think about it. And it's not necessary that you need to shoot now and respond right away. Maybe something during these 10 minutes or towards the end, because maybe a question also requires some reflection. So my question to all of you is, when we look at really a rapid speed of digitalization all around us, what do you think is the calling for youth work field? You know, what youth work as a sector should be doing, or should start doing, or should stop doing something? Yeah. So what is the calling for the youth work field, especially in relation to the digitalization? Because that's what my part is about, a little bit to see what's going on around us, and also what are the questions and how the role of youth workers is changing nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Laimonas. Maybe before we stop sharing and then you start with your input, just as a reminder to go to Menti, the code is the same. So if you had it open, you can keep it. If not, so 15742623, and you also have it in the chat. Yeah. And then once Laimonas is done, we will come back to this slide and see what is the input. The input is already coming, so I will close it quickly so we don't get spoilers. And Laimonas, the mic is yours.
All right. Then I would like to start from a very short audio that will not be coming from me, but it will be a piece of short audio. We can see almost like a podcast. Perhaps you can just, close your eyes and then imagine people talking there, and maybe the environment in which they talk. So, you would feel a bit better what is going on in that audio. And we start now.
So, we've covered the job description of a creative designer and our expectations regarding this position. Next, I'd like to ask you about your upgrades. Your studies and background are covered here in your CV, but what kinds of personal upgrades have you had installed?
This past year, I increased my memory capacity by 1 terabyte, upgraded my flexible thinking to level 7, and maxed out my spatial perception. Here's a complete download report that covers my entire adult life. Of course, I do remember all these in detail if you want me to go through them.
No, that's fine. This report is really good. I have a real-time visual memory upgrade, so I can just scan this. There we go. I should also point out that you might be interested in some of the benefits we offer. We offer in-house access to Datamax 1 upgrades for data processing and a few other goodies too, such as productivity monitoring application, if that's something you're interested in.
Yeah, sounds good. It would make it easier for me to keep track of how my upgrades complement each other.
Where do you see...
All right, we can stop here. So, a small piece from the future. And from now on, I'd like to share also then a few visuals to support my input. What you heard, actually, it is a series of kind of inputs called future frequencies, prepared by the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, that provides really cool toolkits and materials to think and discuss the future and capture the signals of the future. And I'm talking about it because I think when we talk about digitalization, it is really, developing so rapid, so quick that we not only need to look at what do we have right now and how do we respond to it, but also really have our antennas out and think, what is upcoming, what are the trends, what is going to happen very, very soon. Maybe that audio, is from a bit more distant future. But human upgrades are coming, and already you can see, you can have certain clothes that you can lift more heavy objects, there is electronics that can be installed in bodies and so on. So just to imagine also, how much is happening there. And, when we talk about digitalization of society and what youth work can do and how to respond, my calling is also to think about the future thinking and apply it in a way. And here there are a few principles that there is more than one possible future, of course, because we talk about forecast. We don't know exactly. We can influence future by our actions. And I think we do have responsibility to think long term and act now, based on what we see, on what is happening, and signals reaching us. And during the MOOC on digital youth work, we invited people to explore and read so-called megatrend cards that are coming from the same Sitra fund. And many people chose, among many other trends, the one trend that, of course, it's about the next wave of digitalization all around. So much going on, we can see examples of virtual reality, augmented reality, gesture control, Internet of Things, and so on and so on. People chose other things, not only about digitalization. They chose that climate change is really happening and it makes impact on people's work. Empowerment of girl and women, for example, was mentioned there. And adding to these trends, I also chose a few that I think are very important. And I see Sami from Finland High also sharing some links to future frequencies resources in the chat. I would add for you that technology really transforms the way people operate. And I think many of you could see that in pandemic. It really was changing the way youth workers operate and the way people reach to young people, the way they communicate, the way they network, activities they do. I think another important aspect is really increasing role of artificial intelligence. It's coming into our reality in a way. And it's there, it's making impact, and we need to be aware of what it is, how does it influence us and our work. And another trend that is there, and I think it's kind of already not really a trend, but a necessity of here and now, is that we have to start understanding technology better. We should stay curious. We should see what is it, how it impacts our life. Are we just passive users of this technology, or can we become more active in shaping it, making influence to it? And people were also from the course were picking up on a number of tensions, and tensions often become when something new is coming and kind of making impact on nowadays normality in a way. And then there are a few tensions right here. Technology is coming, and it can be a huge opportunity for so many things, for social aspects, civic aspects, fighting with climate change. At the same time, it can be a threat. It can be a threat for privacy, for well-being, for even the same climate change. Now we are realizing how much resources technology is using, and now there is a lot of conversations going on how this technology can be more climate friendly. And people were picking a lot on the impact of technology and what is the impact in terms of creating inequality or a kind of technological gap, and what is the role of youth work actually here of not leaving some people behind or helping them with access to technology, access to devices, so that they can fully participate, especially seeing how much is moving online. A lot of governmental services, education is moving online, and so on and so on. There, we can already see number of things in a way happening around us and in youth work. And I think really youth work has a great potential to do what is good at doing. I think it has good potential in developing critical thinking and kind of value-based, approach to all these processes. The way data is used, the way data is monetized, what do we do with that? And there are already, NGOs and organizations that are trying to fight that, trying to fight on the highest level with companies and so on. But I think also organizations can deal with young people who will probably later going to go to tech companies and so on. And youth work organizations can deal still with giving better awareness, developing consciousness about ethics, about values that are important in every part of life. And we see these discussions going on right now. And we see signals in youth work as well. We can see, video games being used. We can see chatbots. If you go to Eurodesk Facebook page, there will be a mobility chat, and this bot, right? And this mobility bot will help you to kind of orientate about your opportunities. We have, exploring youth participation, exploring artificial intelligence. Youth work has, I think, huge potential to use online volunteering that is starting now in different parts of the world. And here I have a couple of questions in a way how digitalization can help and increasing different technologies, how it can help to reach to young people, to support goals of youth work, to engage people, to co-create things, to ensure participation. How do we ensure that people are not left behind these developments? They have access to necessary technology and tools. And then for us as youth workers, I think how we can stay enough agile, keep up with the recent changes, orientate in them. And I saw really a lot of good examples while doing actually MOOC on digital youth work. I had a number of interviews where people were sharing how they really shifted their practices, how they use social media, various digital tools to keep connected, to create safe spaces for young people, and continue the youth work that, continue the mission that they had before pandemic. And many people were saying, yes, we will definitely take some good practices forward. We might blend them with day-to-day work with young people, but we don't want to forget that experience. We want to make use of the best practices we've got. And people had many ideas of, combining some digital tools, doing some treasure huntings, and creating some participation spaces online, because they noticed that some people joined only through online activities who were not coming face-to-face before. So it was really interesting to see how some youth organizations managed actually to kind of increase that community around them. By the way, this is photo from Vilnius, where they built a portal between two cities, so where people can actually get to this portal and say hi to each other, or send some messages to each other and connect. Here are a couple of more things. We asked people to comment how the role of youth workers is changing. And people were saying, that our role now seems becoming to create safe digital spaces for young people, and also to engage young people in co-creating these spaces. Youth workers also becoming really moderators, and involving young people to co-moderate conversations and networking with others online. People were saying that still our role as youth workers is to create meaningful relationships in that digital world and to create meaningful interactions with each other. And I suppose we already will have some answers to the calling of youth work from the MOOC. There were a few things mentioned, that there was calling to connect, to collaborate, to be flexible and adaptive, to develop 21st century skills. People were mentioning the calling to be future-proof, right? So being able to deal with the upcoming trends, but also upcoming challenges. Shall we look then into the
Yes, we shall.
Menti. I need to stop sharing probably.
Okay, I can.
Yep. You can take over.
Exactly. So here we go.
Ooh. Okay.
There are also questions there, so you can maybe pick up from there. And then I also showed the one from Adina, because one thing about professionalization appeared. Yeah, so we can also take first the questions from here and then look at the Q&A.
Yeah. First question, there was how can someone be involved in making a MOOC? The good thing that now there are increasing amount of platforms actually to create an online course. And whether it's a small course, whether it's a massive course, it really depends on kind of ambition and, well, probably would also say funding. So, but also, I think it can be probably double question that people can contribute to MOOCs. So, for example, a few things I mentioned, actually quite many things I mentioned during these 10 minutes are the contributions of participants. So in a way, they are also co-creating these MOOCs, because very often we don't have answers from the field. We're asking people to contribute what is happening in your context? How do you do things?
We'll come back. There is actually quite a big question in the Q&A. I think we can come back to it later. Laimonas, I'm just looking to at the Menti, and there was one question of how to engage young people in dilemmas and solutions around e-waste. I don't know if you have some thoughts about that.
Not really, no. But I would say first engaging in the conversation and searching for solutions together, I suppose.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same. I think it's the question of maybe the focus is on how to engage young people into any dilemma or solution, yeah, which is part of youth work processes anyway.
And it requires probably researching together, looking for examples together, and seeing what is possible, you know, with the resources people have, or where they can get some resources to achieve that.
There was also a question here about the blocks and inhibitors to kind of this agile attitude of youth workers. Yeah. So maybe one of the dilemmas is whether youth workers are ready to jump on the wagon, let's say.
Yeah. And I think that's, and that comes, I think, with the youth worker training, education, with the resources available in languages that people can speak. Because I think that kind of reflection or agility, it comes by, you know, having colleagues, having a community of practice that is pushing you to move forward, that someone is inspiring there actually to perhaps follow and see what is possible to do. So I think the community of practice is really important here, and systems in place supporting education and training of youth workers in regard to digitalization of society and digital youth work.
Mm-hmm. I think someone also commented this here, yeah, training for youth workers on how to use digital tools in youth work, and probably beyond as well. About digital tools. Anything else to comment maybe on this slide, Laimonas? And then I go back to Adina for a moment.
Yeah, no, I recognize this also. I think we had slightly similar also aspects mentioned in the MOOC by people, because I see it's about, you know, calling to develop methods or to transform youth work methods to online spaces. I think it's always important just to be aware, why do we do that? You know, what is the final goal? Is that part of our mission? And indeed to see how to use, because what I saw from Menti is about utilizing the existing technology and networks. And it's often because of, you know, reaching out to more people, or just, you know, being where young people are. So they are out there in the street, but they're also there on the virtual space.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Laimonas. We're not done with you, but we are done with the part of the input. So thank you for that. And then we'll come back with the questions. And just to see if I can actually move, I cannot move here. There they are. They were, Adina, there was the one thing that appeared when we moved the Menti, but then I checked kind of backstage. It's about professionalization. And as we know, this is one of really the big kind of debates, whether professionalization will lead and to what it will lead. Yeah, what does it mean for youth work? So maybe you can just briefly comment on that if you have any thoughts. And maybe it's also related to this recognition professionalization. So that's one. And then another aspect of professionalization, which is just appearing here on the left, is does it depend on whether people are paid or not, whether it's voluntary or not, and so on. And then I stop sharing and give you the mic.
Yeah, it's basically another theme that would come with us probably for the next 100 years, speaking of youth work, because it's not it's a dynamic concept in the end. And yeah, it goes a lot with different youth work traditions that we have in different countries. So of course that the wonderful story would be the one where youth workers are trained in different courses, including a university ones, if possible, where they would be paid, and where you would find a youth worker delivering services in every local authority, even in a small village where they would have a qualified youth worker, but also youth workers doing voluntary work are doing a wonderful job. So it does depend a lot on different national, local contexts, but of course that we're speaking now of this ideal of having the profession really recognized. And whenever, you know, people would be asking you back home, what do? You you would not somehow shift the answer. So that would be a bit of teaching, a bit of training, a bit of working with young people. But when you say youth work, people would understand exactly what you do. And I think that in different modules, we touched upon this idea of having a real recognition of the work we do and of the importance of having it as a profession with competencies well developed. So, but again, it does come with an answer which is very different from a local context to another local context. So yeah, but it's essential to what we do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And it's interesting, we talk about current debates and some maybe emerge, but actually some, as you said, not only that will follow us to the future, but have also been with us for a long time, yeah, and probably will stay like that. So the time will change. Thank you, Adina. Katja, do we have any questions, Katja Darek, on Q&A or on Facebook for this moment?
Yes, we have one in Q&A, and I think this is the question that comes to all of us at one moment. So I will read it. And especially that both Adina and Laimonas told that some forms of the digital youth work that we started to use now in pandemic are going to stay with us. So the question is, the new formats are quite complex to understand. What are some ways to ease the understanding for people with fewer opportunities, learning difficulties, rural areas lacking connection, etc. Yes, it's a question about inclusion and about the availability and accessibility of it for some specific group of young people. You can start, Adina or Laimonas, as you want.
Well, I would answer. Yeah, because I had a look at the question, and Laimonas was saying earlier that young people are there, so they could be in the virtual space if they have the equipment and the connectivity opportunities, and they are here in the center of the village where I live at the moment, because they meet there to play football. So yeah, for the digital formats, that it starts with training youth workers on how to use them, and then definitely they would be the ones who pass the message to young people in case young people did not somehow manage to understand them better and to help the youth workers, because as you said earlier, it's about building relationships. They might have a very complicated language at the beginning, but then once you start to get used to them, it's easier. But for me, the first thing would be to make sure that we first provide young people with the equipment and with the connectivity, and that's the second level of making sure that they know how to use the tool. So I still have this concern that there are still a lot of groups that don't have the two conditions to be able to get online.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Laimonas?
Very well said. Very similar thoughts, actually. I was just thinking that, there is a big responsibility on the ones responsible for youth policy implementation in certain countries, so that they try really creating that access to technology and access to connectivity right there. So they really prioritize organizations being more far away from capitals and big cities, and really making sure there are training opportunities in place. Doesn't matter where youth workers are working at, and then there are these spaces for people to learn from each other, to get inspired, maybe to translate materials that often are, in not mother tongue, but some foreign languages. So I think here there is really a big responsibility for these institutions as well. And then, of course, responsibility for youth work or national youth work organizations to actually push for that funding, and to push for inclusion as well.
Thank you. And one more question, very concrete one. Many times we say one time we're back to normality, still some digital will stay with us, which we discovered, and some forms will stay with us. So can you, each of you, say example of one of this digital type of activity or tools that we started to use now that will stay when we come back, hopefully one day, to new normal? Yeah,
I can mention, I think throughout these months, we saw more attention and investments into having a virtual youth center in terms of space, where people can gather and they can have their own corner. As an example, Discord, that in some countries it was used more, in some countries less, but now I can see how youth workers really found that space and learn how to navigate there. And it's a space to engage people, to create different channels, different kind of rooms in the youth centers, and also kind of empower young people to become moderators of certain spaces, to take care of it, and so on. And I saw what they noticed, that, for example, young people who left that community and now live in a big city and maybe studying there, they started connecting back to these communities and staying in these youth centers. So this is a really interesting development, and it seems that youth workers are like okay to keep them alive, these virtual spaces, especially for moments when young people are not there at the youth center.
Thank you very much, Laimonas and Adina.
Well, definitely the new normal would include what happened in these 2 years, when the new normal would come. But I would see staying everything that does have youth ownership. So things that were developed with young people, so where they do have, the power and the knowledge to run things. Probably a lot in education. And again, the question, what if not young people are not in education, what's happening with them? And yeah, in terms of youth work, well, in fact, it's basically the essentials are the same, but I would see a lot of blended and hybrid formats happening. So whatever could support those blended and hybrid learning approaches, I think would stay. So.
Thank you very much. And we have one more question. It's somehow connected, and it's connected to your previous answer, Adina, is what would be a solution in terms of reaching them, Adina? I think it's referred to the previous question about young people who have difficulty with access. Do you have anything working for you? As I have the same feeling when it comes down to reaching the targeted group. Just again, we have people from outside of Europe as well, and who are working in very different conditions. So maybe that's why so many interest in the question.
I'm thinking now of the physical activities that we used to do before, and yeah, we don't have a youth center here. And what we did, we learned how to do mobile and detached youth work. So somehow trying to use a bit this proactive approach, because probably would not have a youth center soon, but then what to do to leave young people, without any activity. And it was somehow their suggestion that we could work here where we are. And what it worked in my very tiny context in the village was to approach different stakeholders. So whether it was the school, the local authorities, also some local business. And when we knew that young people did not have the equipment to get online, to find those, and it was possible. And yeah, in a while we solved it for our tiny community, but of course it's not something that you could replicate to bigger ones. And this is why I was saying that it does require a lot of effort in terms of being engaged with policy development, and whether we like it or not, with politics as well, to convince the ones who have the power and the money to do that.
Thank you very much, Adina. And just to remind, because one of our first webinars was about the open youth work and outreach, and there as well you can, if you didn't have chance to see, there are a lot of practical advices and examples about how to reach those young people. Laimonas, would you also like to add something to this? No? Okay, then I think we should move. And Snjana?
Thanks a lot. Adina and Laimonas stay with us, so we will not lose them. But we now shift the focus a little bit to the other part of the inputs. Digitalization, digital youth work, unsurprisingly, take a lot of attention, and it's really the topic of a lot of conversation. And actually, what came to my mind was, I wonder if it wasn't for the pandemic, how long it will take us to get where we are now, with working online. But I'll keep it for myself. I don't want to open another debate. I think it's a topic for some other conversation. So that said, I would like to introduce Ajša Hadžibegović, and the only reason why I can pronounce her name is that we are from the same region. Ajša is a very dear colleague and also a person that passed a lot of different roles in the youth work field, from a youth worker, also manager of a youth work organization. She's also a writer, researcher, trainer, so wears a lot of hats, and I think that will be felt also throughout her input. We also have a question, and Ajša, I'm wondering, would you like to kind of wait for the answers or go more with what Laimonas proposed? I anyways show it, but that maybe you pick it up at the end. What would be your preferred thing? And hello, Ajša.
Hello, Snežana, and thanks for welcoming me. I would go with the question now. I think it's good to start with what is the thinking and what is your experience for every one of you who are there and listening. So the question is really, how do you see the space shifting for youth work from your context and your experience? And I'm stressing the words of context and experience, and I'll come back to them afterwards. So please share a little bit if you are noticing any shifts.
Thank you, Ajša. Menti is the same, the code is the same. So let's see what appears. We purposefully, although we probably announced it at the beginning, didn't say what is the topic of your input, Ajša, because that might give away some things. So let's wait and see what comes.
So I'll come as a surprise.
I think we said it at the beginning, but maybe not just right now, and mentioned it, I think, 1 million times on the MOOC.
Okay, maybe we don't have any thoughts. So let's then do what Laimonas was doing. Okay, 3 at a time.
Yeah, Menti sometimes needs time to refresh. Yeah, so more spaces for youth work are appearing. It means gaining recognition. More openness on both ends. And then there is youth mental health issues. Public funding is cut for LGBT organizations. Yeah, this is more specific kind of.
Yeah. Oh, it's exactly what I will be discussing a little bit, and thanks for this. And maybe we can then wait for the other answers and come back to them.
And just a reminder that it stays open, because I noticed in the previous question, people vote for 1-2 minutes and then stop. So really feel free to use the 10 minutes of Ajša's input to come back and leave it open and then still vote.
Add more thoughts, exactly. But we already seen these three inputs, what I wanted to start with, and this is the question of shifting space or shrinking space. And there are many voices talking about the difference between the two and why we should focus on one and not the other. So we saw in your input that shifting civic space or shifting space for youth work allows for more opportunities. But what I would like to focus in this intervention is on the shrinking of civic space, exactly what was in the final intervention that one of you was mentioning, that there is less funding for LGBTIQ organizations. That's one way of how the space is shrinking for civic activism and for youth participation and etc. So what I would explain a little bit is really what are we talking about when we say shrinking civic space, when this trend is mentioned. Then I hope to raise few examples and maybe answers to the question, why should we be concerned at all with this, particularly for those who feel, well, this is not really relevant for me because in my context the space is shifting and there are more opportunities for youth work. And then at the end, because we are discussing a kind of a wider topic of shrinking civic space, I would go to the idea of or kind of trying to explore a little bit what kind of implication it has or what kind of impact such trend has or might have at youth work, exactly the topic on which we are gathered here for this MOOC. Okay, so if that makes sense to all of you, then I would move to explaining exactly the concept of shrinking civic space. And this is really like the most simple definition says that it is concept that tries to explain the relationship between repressive methods by governments, authorities, system, if you want, and a political struggle by, civil society, by citizens, by people, if you want. And in this, it's not one way. It doesn't work only one way. Like there are repressive methods and there is political struggle, but it also encompasses all these. How do you call that? Like all those interreactions when there is political struggle, how that then inspires different methods, and how reclaiming space can create even more, even more obstruction of that space, and then the impact of the responses to these political struggles of one group, how that can influence also some other groups. And I think in recent years, we are all aware of those through some of the movements that are really global. I would share just one image, if that's okay. So that is just a little bit more visual of what I'm talking about. And the image exactly shows what are the stages. So you have an open space for civic engagement, and the first steps in kind of repressive methods and first steps in trying to influence it in a negative way is when that space is being narrowed. So it's becoming less and less open, or it's more confined into certain spaces. For youth work, it might be, it's in the youth centers, and that's where you do your thing in a way, rather than, all space is there for youth work, etc. The next step is, or the next stage is actually the obstruction of space, which means that there are measures that are actively obstructing the civic engagement, youth participation, kind of political struggle or expression of different opinions or plurality of opinions. Final stage is repression, where there are concrete consequences for your activism that are negatively affecting people and organizations. And finally, complete opposite of the open civic space is the closed one, or there is no civic participation, and there is nothing there for let's say for young people to contribute to in terms of the development of the society. And I think we can discuss, okay, so this is really interesting, but this never happened in Europe, or it doesn't happen to me, it doesn't happen to us. And I think here it's really important to mention that actually the research is showing that the shrinking civic space is really going beyond what we are usually thinking of. So when I was sharing this picture, maybe you were thinking of some democracies that are in trouble, or some countries which do not really have a system that you would call democratic. And this is for them, let's say. But actually the research shows that it is a global trend, and that even the established democracies are not immune to such attempts to either narrow or obstruct or repress some of the civic liberties and some of the civic activism and engagement. And this is also, one important player, Human Rights Watch. In their report, they were also putting civil society as one of the, let's say, endangered actors in the society, in a sense that surveillance of their activities globally is being used more and more as a strategy to intimidate organizations and their activism. And all this is done, not all, but in many cases, this is done by authorities in the pretext of national and public security and foreign interference and kind of issues that we have seen also a lot, for instance, with the pandemic that was mentioned as well, in a sense of, there is a bigger concern or bigger issue at stake, like health issue, and then civic liberties and civic engagement is something that we don't have space for now or time for. And in that case, unfortunately, particularly youth participation is being completely neglected and forgotten. Why I think we should be concerned? Because there are some of the interrelated trends on how this is done, and maybe some of you will recognize them also in your context and your reality. Civicus, a global alliance of civil society organizations, has recognized 10 of those and categorized them. I will just go through a few just to give you a flavor of what are the different measures or different ways in which the space for civic engagement is being obstructed. So just to share a few, for instance, there are measures that are called philanthropic protectionism. So basically meaning that the government protects civil society from receiving any international funding, because in that way the civic space or the countries in place or the citizens within are being influenced in a non-wanted way. There are measures which include regulations and legislation which actually adds to the bureaucracy of registering as a civil society organization or applying for funds, which is then overcomplicated or over-demanding, particularly, for instance, for youth organizations, which often are voluntary organizations and don't necessarily have capacities to actually just technically fulfill all the requirements. There are measures that really directly limit, either through policy or concrete practices, limit or restrict the rights to freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression, and even this freedom of self-actualization. So you were mentioning also LGBTIQ organizations. This is one among those that are really being influenced pretty much by those policies. There is also something that in Europe, particularly, I think we were witnessing, and we can say to what extent it is the reality, that, for instance, human rights defenders and their work is being criminalized. This is particularly the case with the refugees and migrant crisis in Europe, and that then solidarity is almost, you can say, criminalized by different measures put in practice, which are just perpetuating the stigma and discrimination and kind of delegitimizing any attempt to actually behave in accordance to human rights, for instance, as a concept or an instrument, et cetera, et cetera. There are even I need to say there are even the measures that are really also influencing by financing, which is what you mentioned at the beginning, where organizations can face the situation in which their funders are withdrawing because there is created by governments or by authorities, there is this public campaigns created against the issues that the civil society organizations are promoting, and then the funders would just get out from that situation, leaving organizations really in a very difficult position. So there are many examples of such a things. Also, if you're still using Menti, if you feel you experience some of those or some that I didn't mention, please also share. It would be interesting, because this is still a field which is being explored and researched. There seems to be no end to creativity in ways in which authorities are directly or indirectly, completely consciously or sometimes unconsciously in a way, but narrowing and obstructing and repressing the space for civil society. I said that we should be really concerned by this because also of young people and the organizations representing them. If this is the trend happening in the civil society at large, which by definition is capturing one part of the society, how we humans arrange the societies, which is more let's say progressive, or more trying to control, having this control role, or having the role of putting on the agenda some topics that are sensitive and are not necessarily where the society is, but is kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit. And by default, it also has all the expertise and all the let's say all the technical means needed. For the youth civil society, it's much more difficult, and they are affected much more exactly because of the nature of youth and the way of they can organize themselves, and the way in which they can access resources. And in that sense, all the funding, reporting, bureaucratic obstacles are sometimes becoming too much for youth organizations and for young people, and they are giving up on their participation. But then there are also, and youth organizations were reporting, you could see the Youth Forum study from, I think, 2 years ago, where they were reporting that, even when they are participating in the public deliberations, in the policy processes, that at European level or at national level in European countries, with, again, well-established democracies, that young people and those youth organizations felt that their opinion is not really taken into account, and that their contribution to the discussion was more formalistic, so that they were really serving more as a even decoration, if you want, rather than a partner into the process. And then adding to that, there were quite a few reports in this study that you can find around the difficulties in accessing funding and in accessing the different levels from local to European. And also this trend, and I don't know to what extent you were discussing it already in the MOOC, but this trend of kind of having evidence for the impact of youth work, while it has its merits, it's really very easily used to actually bring a greater burden to the organizations, to the young people, to youth workers, in a sense of proving that what they're working on is actually delivering, and that is almost impossible thing to do in a long-term intervention as youth work is. But that is another discussion. But just to add that this kind of from business sector, those indicators of market of like you invested that much money, you worked with that much people, young people, and the result is expected to be this now, today, is something that is really limiting the possibilities for youth work to actually do anything practically, because they need to focus on reporting and finding evidence and discussing different indicators, etc. Another element that I want to raise is just that why should we be concerned, which I mentioned at the beginning, is that because young people in particular are affected by this, and because if what Laimonas was saying before, if we look at the future a little bit, and we look at the future from the perspective of young people who today are not participating because the spaces are not there for them to participate, then we can imagine, tomorrow's decision makers or tomorrow's adults and citizens who have not experienced youth participation firsthand, who have not experienced how democracy works, who have not experienced how what is the power of citizens and how they can influence the processes in the society, and in that way we will really, maybe I'm over pessimistic with this, but that's the topic. But and maybe it is my role to really scare all of us a little bit so that we are more alert to those practices being somehow introduced in our everyday reality, because the idea is then that you would actually have generations of citizens of population who will not miss anything because they didn't have any experience of things being done differently. And in this way, civil society as well, and development of civil society, I think, will be impacted in a sense that we cannot even comprehend yet, by the very fact that we allow that now, some generations of young people are missing opportunities to participate because of this trend. And I think what maybe we need to all focus on a bit more is that this is specifically difficult because governments are the one who should kind of create the space for civic engagement. And with this trend, it's so annoying that actually the governments are the one who are, first suspect in the ones who are actually narrowing that space. And that's where the difficulty lies. I promise that at the end I will come to the question of how does this impact youth work. And I think, really particularly in Europe and from European level, it's really hard to see the links, because you will see that youth work is being more and more recognized and promoted, both at European and national levels, that it's being mentioned in the Council of Europe Youth Strategy. There is now a Bonn process that has been launched, and the youth work is kind of getting on the agenda. Again, just with the pretext of being a tool to solve some of the issues that decision makers are also recognizing, and particularly in case of young people being more and more detached from the participation processes and from politics, if you want even. But still, youth work is kind of gaining recognition, and this shift is, you could say, is positive. However, what we are not seeing, and what often kind of goes under the surface, is that, for instance, the financial resources allocated to youth work have been decreasing. And there is even a report that says that they have been decreasing to the level of 30% with the last economic crisis in 2008. And this report was done for the European Commission by researchers. So this is something that is really concerning, and showing that it seems the playground that we are playing in with the youth work is decreasing, even though we are not maybe necessarily completely conscious of that or aware of that. Another thing, but maybe Yael will speak about this much more, is exactly the depoliticization of youth work, and this is how space is shrinking for civic engagement. If the youth work becomes less and less engaged with societal issues and with politics and policies and with all the things that concern the young people, and it's much more around the things that who knows who puts on the agenda, or it's much more around just free time. Not saying this is wrong, but just if we are allowing that youth work is decreased to just one of its functions, that is again influencing the space for youth engagement and for their participation. And I think maybe a last word, and I spent quite some time, sorry for that, is that we just need to be reminded that youth work is the one that helps young people to self-express, to figure out the world, to actually engage with the world and all the things happening around them, and make sense of them, and make their in a way make their opinion about what and how should things look like. And this is what we are jeopardizing but this is what is being jeopardized by those trends. And I think it's really important that we all are more alert. That's the final message from my side, I would say. I don't know if we have more things, Snežana, on the Menti.
Thank you, Ajša. There are some more, but since this was a bit longer, as you said,
sorry.
That's okay. I will actually, I think, move immediately to Yael. Because I think, as you were saying, you already kind of made the link, and I think Yael will definitely connect to your input, not just because the two of you are also cooperating and working together, but simply the topics are also quite connected, and maybe all together we can look then later on this. So thank you so much, Ajša. You also stay with us, and as I said, now we move to Yael. Yael is an expert in non-formal education and international youth work, just like Ajša, but also our other speakers as well. She had a very exciting path through youth work and non-formal education, also international level, and now it's working for Open Societies Foundation. And she will tell you much more in a minute. But I think we will start, Yael, also with a question. Yeah, is that okay? Very good. So I will show the Menti, and then I will also be showing Yael's slides, and she will tell us how to navigate that. Just bear with me. Go back to Menti. All right. And I think the question will immediately tell us a little bit about the topic of Yael's input, which is, what is the political dimension of the youth work that you do? Yeah, so not kind of a theoretical debate of what is a political dimension in general of youth work, but really of the work that you do. So what is there a political dimension? Menti is open, the code is the same, so please contribute. We will maybe wait for a few moments to see what comes, and then at the end we will also take a look once more, together with maybe additional things that came for Ajša's question as well. Hopefully Ajša's input didn't scare you too much, although, as you were saying, Ajša, that's part of the purpose of it as well. And surely we will hear more about this. Maybe get scared, but hopefully also empowered through Yael's input. I have one contribution so far about food justice. I wonder if it's about the distribution of food, or but we'll see more. Tackling ethno-nationalism and fascism. Very nice. Maybe very nice is not actually the word, but it sounds super relevant and important. Stimulating political youth engagement. Excellent. I never know how to pronounce this, Europeanization of youth work, making youth work more European, raising awareness, critical thinking, a lot of exclamation marks there, taking a stance on topics, making room for marginalized voices, power critical approaches to political education. Very good. I think we can stop here. Please keep them coming. I have a feeling that this already gives Yael good food for the input. And then, Yael, mic is yours. Would you like me to share a presentation immediately? Yeah. Okay.
So thank you, Snežana. Thank you to the other speakers. Actually, I have the very strong feeling that my input is rather, how would you say, is rather superfluous at this stage, given that so much has been said, which in many respects sort of just underscores what I want to say, which is, next slide, that youth work is political. Surprise, surprise. This is probably the most basic statement. And if anybody of you has heard me speak before, you know that this is something I say every single time I get asked about this topic. And just to contextualize this stuff, I want to make 4 points about youth work being political. but I'm speaking to the European youth field. I noticed that a lot of our participants in the MOOC are also working in other contexts, not necessarily in the European youth work context, but in other continents, in national spaces, internationally, globally, so on and so forth. Nevertheless, I do think that a number of the things I have to say apply sort of maybe more universally. I wouldn't want it to be understood as kind of Eurocentric, but you know, that's a kind of political debate in and of itself, and it's one which I'll pick up on a little bit later. So, no, you got to go back one. Yeah, youth work is political. So why do I say that youth work is political, right? A lot of the things that have been raised so far, also in the Menti, also by the other speakers, and especially by Ajša, point in that direction, right? That youth work has some contents, youth work has some processes, youth work has some relationships and interactions which have to do with politics. But I would like to point out or focus on the fact that youth work is considered social and political, social and personal work, social and developmental work. I mean, a number of the speakers talked about the development of young people's personalities, and but you know, that the fact of social and personal work being present in youth work also makes it political. And why do I say that? I mean, you just have to take the example of the young woman who comes to the youth center during the week and speaks about her experiences with patriarchal relations in her family or in society. And, you know, that kind of a reality, okay, which is a very personal reality for that young woman and for that young person, is nevertheless, you know, it has political implications for the youth work. And when that kind of reality is present in youth work, then youth work also has to ask itself questions about society and questions about how society deals with those situations of injustice, of maybe racism, of discrimination and other kinds of unequal power relations. There is a book written in the 1980s in the UK by a woman called Kumkum Bhavnani, who is a youth researcher, called The Politics of Youth Clubs. And she defined politics as the contestation and regulation of unequal power relations. So when that kind of reality is present in youth work, even though it's social and personal work, it also means that you know, that youth work is political, and it means that youth work is also civic work, right? It has something to do with society. So it's, you know, it's about the kind of society that young people live in, and it's about the kind of society that young people want to live in, and it's about how politics, which is the way in which our societies, our democracies organize living in society together. It's about how politics is addressing those. And it's about where young people fit in all of that, if at all. No? And so, you know, basically as a result, we're talking about youth work as not only social and personal work, but also youth work as civic work. And, you know, in a variety of contexts, we see that youth work is also the subject of politics, right? So if we looked at, you know, recent developments, somebody mentioned earlier on the Bonn process, the Third European Youth Work Convention recognition, all the policy-making processes that go on around youth work, okay, make it also, you know, they have a political impact on youth work. They, you know, youth work is the object of a certain number of political struggles. And at the same time, youth work is not necessarily, you know, aware of that. Youth work in its practice on a day-to-day basis, you know, very often the politicized issues around youth work are not necessarily part of the youth work content. They're not necessarily reflected in the practice, and they're not necessarily questioned and developed upon with young people. So that brings me to my second point. So next slide. Which is that youth, especially now I'm talking very much in terms of the European context, youth work has become increasingly depoliticized, right? So I've just said, at the risk of contradicting myself, I've said youth work is political, but now actually I'm saying that youth work has become depoliticized. And why do I say that? I say that because there are 4 things that have happened in the last 15 to 20 years that we can observe through research and different kinds of anecdotal evidence from practice and so on. I do have to generalize a bit and reduce a bit, but nevertheless, I think that many of you will be able to identify with these developments. The first thing that I think has become very obvious is that when we start to talk about youth work in the community of practice, right, as having a political dimension, right, even when we start to talk, when we talk about more established terms which are accepted and even valued in the context of youth work in Europe, when we talk about things like human rights education or active citizenship, civic education, very many members of our community of practice, and that be it practitioners or researchers or the political stakeholders, I mean the politicians, they feel uncomfortable. It makes them hot under the collar. And it's because they think about things like political parties, and they think about things like corruption or self-interest, and they don't want youth work to get mixed up in that. And they think about having to take a position, or rather, not having to take a position because of the risks that that might bring with it. I mean, Ajša's presentation was very clear about that there are risks with taking a position by now. And, taking a position means putting yourself out there. It means making a statement. And it takes, this kind of process, this sense of the political takes youth workers, it takes youth work and the entire community of practice out of its comfort zone. We don't want to get into trouble. So the second thing is, the second point and development I would like to refer to here is that youth work that is addressing politicized issues being issues of controversy in the political spectrum in a country, in Europe, so on and so forth. These are finding it harder and harder to access funding from anyone, from the state, from European level funders, even from private philanthropic funders. And I don't need to explain what those are. I mean, one of the Mentimeter contributors mentioned the closing down or the lack of availability of funding for LGBTQI organizations, but there are such an enormous number of topics which would be considered politicized and too controversial, too hot to handle. And many of our institutions are nervous about getting involved with those topics. And in the European context, many of the funding mechanisms that are available to youth work and the recognition mechanisms that are available to youth work also feel very uncomfortable with getting involved with that kind of issue, because they're government agencies, put it that way. And this is also a manifestation of the shrinking space. So the next thing that I'm going to say is probably going to sound a bit confronting in the context of this MOOC, because it is about sort of youth work and supporting youth work and developing youth work. But many of the structures and projects of the European youth field are increasingly concerned with youth work and youth policy, as such, right? And for the sake of itself. Right? So recognition, professionalization, standard setting. And, in some respect, there's rather little critical engagement with the role of youth work in, affecting positive change regarding, with regard to wider questions affecting the world, wider questions affecting Europe and the continent, from climate change to intergenerational solidarity, to human rights, whatever it might be. And finally, The fourth point I'd like to raise here with regard to developments taking place and this depoliticization is that, ideas like learning mobility, employability, constructive leisure time, they're very valuable and very important, but they've come to replace other aspects which were, inherently much more obviously political, right? And which were more traditionally present in the narrative of youth work about itself, about what youth work was for. So things like intercultural learning, civic engagement, activism, social change, right? So, these developments are there, they're present, and they have manifestations, right? And, in my opinion, at the very least, and based on my research, next slide, why is that important? They are basically, I would say, displacing the center of gravity of youth work. There's a lot of work that has been done by researchers, and many of you will know the name Howard Williamson and Philip Cousset. Both of them have done incredible historical research on, what youth work, how youth work developed, what it is in Europe, across Europe, at European level, at national level. They've described it in terms of policy. They've described it in terms of contents. They've described the history of it. And, they say that there is such a thing as the common ground of youth work, right? And that common ground is what I would like to refer to as the center of gravity. And this idea that the true center of gravity of youth work is civic work, is a kind of political work, is something which many organizations and many youth work providers, many youth workers, basically they don't like the idea. It makes them uncomfortable, and they would define themselves differently. Next slide, please. So why is that important in any way at all? What's the significance of that development? Next slide, please. This is a quote that I use all the time. The smartest way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to allow very lively debate within that spectrum. And Noam Chomsky wrote this in a book called The Common Good in 1998. And I think this is the risk. This is the risk of the depoliticized European youth work model, right? The risk is that essentially youth work provides spaces for acceptable discussion, right? But everything else which is outside the realm of that acceptable discussion is ignored. It doesn't exist. It has no significance. It has no space. Another manifestation of the closing space for civil society and for youth work. Next slide, please. And this whole sort of complex of developments really does have negative impacts, right? For, many of the, how would I say, for a couple of the really basic fundamental objectives that youth work is known to have, right? And exists to deliver, such as solidarity between people, community between people. And at least in the European youth work context, solidarity is one of the key keywords, the key deliverables, as it were, that youth work is expected to somehow contribute to. So, this depoliticized youth work and the policies that perpetuate it, they see it as a neutral and objective form of education. It conceptualizes it as a means for individual personal qualification and advancement. And it proposes it as a form of liberal transaction. Somebody mentioned capitalism before. It's very much this idea of transaction. I go to youth work and I get something for it. And, it sees the primary role of youth work as to produce obedience to the state and the system and a kind of system conformity. The creation of herds of worker bees on the basis of which global capital flows to those who already have a lot. And this this essentially immunizes young people from recognizing the structures of oppression that are lying underneath the realities they and others around them experience. I mean, Ajša referred to the fact that, if you've never known anything else, okay, then non-participation, why would you know that participation is important? So that's basically what it boils down to. I think I'm running over time. In any case,
yes.
Yes. Okay. So I'll try to wrap it up. Basically, we'll have to skip a few things. I wanted to give an example. The next slide. I wanted to give if you could go to So I wanted to give an example from intercultural learning. You can skip to the next one, because that's pedagogy, right? So many of you will know this. This postcard. It's on sale in Brussels at souvenir shops. And it really represents a very static form of cultural analysis, okay? But at the same time, today we look at this and maybe many of us would cringe, right? But so many of our pedagogical tools are still informed by this kind of social and cultural analysis. Basically, if only we could all get on, it's only about dealing with our individual prejudices and so on and so forth. So the idea, for example, in the context of something like racism, which was also mentioned as something that youth works on and should work on, constructing racism as an individual pathology and an aberration necessitating re-education. Gavin Titley wrote about that already 20 years ago. Next slide, please. So these are some examples of activities which are really common in European youth work. They're in many of the guidebooks and the manuals, but they belie a certain kind of European cultural superiority, domination in quasi-colonial settings. They talk about bounded and frozen, cultures frozen in time. And they require, in many respects, of the racialized young people who these activities are there to talk about, to develop an intercultural understanding. But what happens is, in the context of these activities, many, the young people who are themselves victims of racial injustice, they end up having to educate their white colleagues about white supremacism and oppression of racialized others. So this model of youth work practice, okay, is simply inadequate to today's concerns, and the concerns that indeed youth work is expected to address. So next slide. So the Wheel of Power and Privilege, you can find this pretty much anywhere in the internet. This is a different approach, right? And a youth work that I think, how would I say, which addresses this idea of being, or a youth work which is politically literate, okay, would take an approach that, goes more in this direction, where we question, right, and where we naturalize the idea of problematization, okay? Questioning the status quo and challenging the inevitability of that status quo. So next slide, and I'll close on this. Next slide, please. We need to revamp the terms of the European youth work discourse, right? And that means it's time for radical renewal. That means that next slide, please. We need to think about ourselves as educators, and we also need to think about ourselves as provocateurs. Henri Giroux is an American theorist who wrote about this in a book called Youth in a Suspect Society, Disposability or Democracy. And it really talks about very incisively about kind of attitudes and approaches that allow us to think about the role of youth work and the things that we're doing with young people in terms of democratizing democracy. And yeah, I think that's basically the thing that I would like to finish on. Maybe one last comment is that the key to an authentic and politically literate practice in European youth work is not shouting about the fact that we value our values, right, such as human rights or whatever, but that young people and educators, us, our community of practice, have the chance to question the ways in which the rest, we and the rest of society go about living up to those values. And this is a bit of shameless self-promotion. This is basically the paper from which this presentation and these comments is derived. And thank you, and sorry for taking so long.
Thank you very much, Yael. I also very warmly recommend reading the paper. As Yael knows, I think I said it already, it's one of really the few things that I read in one go. And I think it really captures the things that Yael said and more. Yeah. So if this is the topic that kind of tickles you a little bit, it's definitely worth to read. So thank you both. I actually propose that we go through the Menti. I show you both slides and maybe invite both of you to see if there is something that kind of invites you to comment quickly and something, and then we see what kind of questions we have. Would that work? All right. Okay. Just a second. So here we have a few more additions to the political dimension of the youth work that people do. I think what we didn't mention before was being an important actor to help for orientation of the policymakers. So there's a few comments about youth policy, actually. Taking a stance on topics, making room for marginalized voices. Not that we actually read before. Municipal youth work and the status of it in the municipal, waiting for it to appear, decision making. So there are different levels in which people can actually be active in that sense. So the rest, I think we mentioned. Anything to comment here for the moment? It's not a must. It's also just informative for both you, Ajša and Yael.
So if I may just make one comment on the Menti. How would I say that? I think it's really interesting that very often at least in talks that I've had with youth workers and people involved in youth work and so on, the immediate reference that people have when they think about sort of a political dimension of youth work is, somehow youth work supporting young people to do politics, right? So whether that's engaging with politicians about access to some kind of service or policy or resources or whatever it is. So, that level of politics, or to be politically active in the sense of, voting in elections and I don't know what else. And I think there's a middle ground between those two things, which is that young people have ideas about society of their own, about Europe of their own, right? Which are, and about what Europe should look like and what society should look like. And that these are very rarely considered in political processes, right? But at the same time, young people can act on those themselves through activism, through social engagement, through volunteering, and so on and so forth. And so I think there's, if there's a role that youth work can play, which is neither taking a political stance nor not taking a political stance to the extent of being apolitical, it's the duty to inform, right? It's the idea that, within the space of youth work, young people can find out about how to engage. Young people can find out about how to be civically active. They can learn things which are important for them, right? But they can also do things which are important for society. And that's also good enough, but there still needs to be a social analysis behind that kind of work. There still needs to be some kind of thinking about, well, why is it that we're doing this in society? So I think, on the one hand, yes, youth policy provides equal opportunities to young people, right? But youth policy also needs to provide support for that kind of questioning, even if it means that the municipal government or the national government and the policy of the government is questioned.
Thank you. Okay, so exactly what I wanted to do, but here we go with the previous one. Some we already saw, people saying that youth space is opening. There are people in the political system, I assume, having roles in the decision-making positions. Something about, again, the online digital spaces, whether that will have any impact. So.
Yeah, maybe one comment, or actually two comments, if you allow, Snezhana.
Just brief, yeah?
Yeah, very, very brief. One thing with the digital, there was this comment if the decision makers would discover how digital is very easy to control and to limit. I mean, Laimonas was saying that there is a lot of liberty and freedom and, open space in the digital world, but we need to be alert exactly of how that can easily be also controlled and limited even without our knowledge. And that's where the issue is. And as youth workers, what Yael was also mentioning, I mean, we need to really be informed and help also young people stay informed and kind of consciously accept if they are accepting to be, in such limited or controlled digital spaces. But of course, every space is there to be, controlled as much as we allow it as citizens, I would say. So in that sense, again, alert for me is the keyword. And another thing, just a little comment is, if we are not feeling that this is happening to us and this is happening in our reality, I think there is an element there of, of needing to think a bit more globally, even when we are working at a very local level, because we are being influenced by global trends. We are being influenced by policies being shaped, at levels that we probably cannot access or feel we cannot access. And as youth workers, this thing of awakening solidarity for fellow young people or fellow youth workers in the other countries that are being oppressed or whose liberties are being severely limited is something that I think is crucial, because otherwise, we are really staying in our little, silos or, what's the opposite of ghettos, but like the ghetto, but the nice one, where you feel all is okay and we don't care about what's happening in the other spaces. And I think that's really the dilemma, I would say, even for, me engaging at local level, to what extent we really need to be, at least with one ear or one eye, kind of following what's happening in other spaces, not just because it might come to us, but also because it's not fair. And that's the comment. Thanks.
Thanks, Ajša. I think they call them bubbles nowadays, although that word is quite overused as well. So thank you so much. And especially, I think, given that our MOOC is fairly global, I think that really resonates a lot in that sense. Yeah. So it's even if the bubble is really large and then extends to Europe, let's say, it's still, there is world out there as well. So thank you. I pass the mic to Darek to see whether there are any questions at this point. We have still a few minutes before we close.
Yes, we have. Thank you. We have very little time, but there are two questions, maybe just a short reflection or short answer. One is about what are the issues that have arisen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic in the area of policy. Are there any policies that take into account the psychological issues that have arisen during the pandemic? I think there's a lot of mention about it in the final declaration of the Third European Youth Work Convention. I don't know, Ajša, if you want to comment. You were in the drafting group of the final declaration, so I just spot you. Maybe you would like to comment on that.
Yes, I was dealing with the other topic though, but I can comment on one thing which I picked up, and that is connected with what my interest is, which is this shifting and shrinking spaces, and that is that pandemic really normalized quite a lot of the measures and kind of shortened public deliberations around different policy procedures to introduce policies. And I mean, I don't know about policies on psychological effects on young people, but I would It seems that's my role today, but I would really be a bit alert and worried about, if it would be very fast into implementation without a lot of public discussion and without involvement of young people. Because again, we are so near of just putting young people into the receiving end of what we feel should be good for them because there was pandemic. So I would just go to reverse that. The first public policy I would suggest, there would be to discuss with young people what kind of support they need or how they feel because they skipped a year or two, basically in their very, very important developmental age and everything. So I didn't really answer the question, but used it to promote shamelessly my ideas still. But thanks for that, Derek.
That's okay. I just mentioned that if somebody is really interested, it's good to have a look at the final declaration because there are some recommendations for policy development in the area of supporting young people's mental health and well-being. Thank you. I have a question myself, actually, Ajša. If you are now speaking and you were talking about the shrinking space, and I live in a country where the space is really shrinking for youth organizations, especially the ones that are not really promoting the governmental policies or are perceived as bad organizations. Nobody knows why, but they are. Sometimes they work with the people that the government is neglecting or trying to also punish for nobody knows what. But yeah, that's the idea. But I have a more kind of practical question. Do you know any examples of, and maybe it's also related with what Yael was talking, do you know any examples of how young people or youth work are engaging with these changes? Both on kind of, because I can see that there is this kind of, what I observe here is this kind of very strong political youth engagement of young people and also very strong non-political. And so do you know any examples of how young people are engaging with the shrinking space, with the changes that they experience?
Yeah. If I may, in my experience, they are finding another spaces. They're finding alternative spaces, and they are, almost creating a parallel, if you want, realm. In which, as you said, also this apolitical, I'm seeing that being a trend as well. That in which they would often go about, okay, here. We will not discuss even to that extent and be apolitical, but we can be okay with each other. And I think there is risk there because, again, if there is not a little bit of support, a little bit of guidance, who knows where will that end up? And another important element there for society is when the energies are being diverted into alternative spaces and are not allowed to be expressed in the, let's say, mainstream, in the public deliberations. I must say it like this. They can become also disruptive. Maybe that will be good for our societies because we seem to be, taking things for granted and being kind of, in the lullaby of living, particularly in Europe, of, kind of well-off democratic societies. And maybe that would be a needed thing. But, if you want to look into the future, I would, as a responsible policymaker, I would look into, how some of those energies can become then disruptive because they are not heard or they are not, being taken into account. But what you are saying, Derek, is unfortunately what I was mentioning at the beginning. It's what governments deliberately do to actually shape what is allowed, what Yael was mentioning, what is allowed to be in the public realm. And I think it's really up to young people, youth workers, but also citizens at large to just, say no. I don't know how else to put it in a way. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you for this. Okay, there is a question. What are some new research areas on political youth work or depoliticized youth work? One of the new research areas, the question is about areas, but I think Yael in her paper describes a lot, and you mentioned quite a lot. I don't know, Yael, if you would like to comment on this question.
Yeah, I have to say that in mainstream youth work research, right, there's been a lot of talk in sort of, how would I say, there's been a lot of research, and my paper is part of that, around, how would you say that, sort of policy and how that may support or inhibit a political dimension of youth work being acceptable or whatever. So it's more like policy research. There's been relatively little research done recently about how programs that are the result of policy, especially at the European level, are actually faring when it comes to a number of, let's say, indicators. Like in the paper, I talk about a couple of markers for what could be considered, a political dimension in youth work, right? And there's very, very little sort of empirical research. There's very little sort of analysis of the programs. I mean, number crunching even about project types, project themes, that would tell us something about the extent to which, in reality, the programs and the youth work that the program supports has become depoliticized. We have practice narrative. There's a lot of storytelling, right? And there's a lot of extremely important stories to be told about how you can do youth work that is, how would I say, successful in addressing those political issues, right? And being supportive to young people who are marginalized, and so on and so forth, right? But the leap between that practice and the structural change of a society is huge. And we don't have research that links the two, right? So, or at least we don't have a lot of credible research that links the two. Okay, so there's an awful lot of stuff on attitudes. There's a lot of stuff on, it's always a little bit siloed. And I think part of the difficulty is that we've become, and somebody mentioned it, I'm not sure who, but somebody mentioned this idea of research and evaluation having become so important, right? And this whole thing of proving impact, right? But in the end, you're proving impact in order to make sure that you have resources to continue what you've done always. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's no added value in asking the critical question, well, why weren't we able to change society, right? And yet we are told that youth work should be able to do that. So I think there's definitely space for improvement there, and there are research categories and initiatives, but they don't focus on this question of the political literacy of youth work.
Thank you. So there is still a lot of space for research here, and also in other areas, like Ajša was mentioning as well, that this is the area that's also the shrinking space, is the area that's being researched, and we still are missing a lot of information and disconnecting different dots and seeing a little bigger picture. I see that there is one question on the chat. I'm not sure I would like to ask it because this question will take probably another 2 hours or even more, because it's about what does it look like in Europe, in the European society being depoliticized, what is happening with the society. I think that's a little bit more. We need a little bit more time to actually discuss it, and probably it's not that easy as well. It's still going to be our point of view, or the people who are here, it will be our point of view, not really maybe the overarching, the bigger picture. I would actually like to finish with asking you all our panelists today, the question that we actually asked to our participants as well in the MOOC when discussing when being in this last module, when we are talking about the youth work, what's happening, what's the vision. Actually, what's the future of youth work according to you? What's your vision? I don't know who would like to start. I'm talking also. It's not only the question to Yael and Ajša, it's also the question to Adina and Laimonas.
I can start, because I would say that I have no clue about that, just because for me, everything is dynamic. So youth is changing every day, so then youth work has to evolve with it. So if we are thinking what's the future of youth, then we can also imagine what's the future of youth work. But I would really see more and more youth workers being there on the stage and helping young people, making their voice heard. So as long as youth evolves, then youth work would evolve as well.
Thank you, Adina. Maybe go with Laimonas, like in the same order that we started.
Yes, forecasting future is a tricky business in a way. I do think that, of course, youth work will go along with the societal changes, whichever they are. And I was focusing more on digital aspect, and I do believe digital youth work will be, reaching out to more people. It will be more, more connected, more networked. I think it will go. And it will reach many more links with other sectors of young people's life than it is now. I do believe it will become more international because, networking becomes easier, traveling becomes easier, and there will be much more shared knowledge, which we see already in the last, I think, 20, 30 years, how much exchange is happening, in Europe, but also beyond. So that an access to that knowledge, I think, is really vital for keeping youth work innovative, interesting, and relevant.
Thank you. Thank you, Laimonas. Ajša.
In future, I see youth work. let's put it like that. I think as long as it stays relevant to where young people are, and not following some other agendas, but where young people are and what they need, youth work will be there, and it has a role to play. So yeah, and we will always have dilemmas and discussions and everything, but yeah, it will be there.
Mm-hmm. Good. That's good news, Ajša. Thank you. Yael.
I don't know whether I should give the optimistic or the pessimistic view.
You can give both. You can give
but
both.
I think what I'd like to say is that it will be deinstitutionalized because the youth work that I see that's most interesting, my opinion, of course, but it's the stuff around Black Lives Matter. It's the stuff coming out of communities. It's the stuff on the streets. And that's not funded by the European Union. That's not funded by institutions. That happens out of the community.
Thank you. I think we have a lot of food for thought after this webinar. Snežana, I give the floor back to you to finish.
Thank you, Darek. And actually, to finish, we will invite a bit of color in our lives, not just through words, which we heard a lot, but also through visuals. So I invite Ajša to share the visual that she has created so far, that will also receive finishing touches, but still for now, so we see it. There's already color in her desktop, and here we go. I think if nothing else, it definitely perfectly captures that there was a lot said during the webinar. We cannot really read fully what is there, but luckily we were here on the webinar, and I'm sure that this will be very useful for those who could not join us. Here we go. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ajša. For the MOOC participants, you will be able to see it on our MOOC page. And for the others, we will also share it via social media. And since we are already a little bit over time, I would just like to thank our guest speakers. Thank you so much for that. I was personally very much looking forward to this webinar because I enjoy dilemmas and debates, and I think definitely a lot of it was raised here, but it doesn't stop. So you saw the questions on Mentimeter. Also think about it. I think critical thinking is definitely one of the aspects that is very much related to youth work. So we should keep it going. So thank you, Adina, Laimonas, Ajša, Yael, and thank you to my team, and thank you to everyone who joined, and have a great afternoon.